At 75, Andy Serkis names 5 people who left scars on his soul. The room was dim, wrapped in that quiet amber shade that arrives just before dusk, when shadows lengthen and memories become louder than the present. At 75, Andy Serkis sat by the window, fingers tracing the rim of a cold porcelain cup, as though searching for something he had lost decades ago. Outside, London kept moving, but inside, time felt suspended. A soft, heavy pause in the middle of a life that had been anything but gentle. His voice, when it finally rose, was barely above a whisper, a confession escaping after years of silence. "There are 5 people," he murmured, "whose shadows I have never managed to outrun. 5 people who left scars on my soul." It was a sentence shaped by a lifetime of contrasts, brilliance and darkness, applause and abandonment. Characters born from motion, yet anchored in pain. For a man celebrated for giving life to creatures of myth, it was paradoxical how deeply real wounds had carved themselves into him. The older he grew, the clearer the echoes became. Footsteps disappearing down hallways, words sharper than blades, promises that dissolved like fog. Tonight he wasn't Gollum or Caesar or any of the legends he embodied. He was simply Andy, a man looking back, holding the truth with trembling, reluctant hands. And as the last ray of light grazed his cheek, the question hung between breath and silence, fragile yet immense. Who were these 5 faces he could never forgive? The memories of that quiet evening drifted seamlessly into the earlier chapters of Andy's life, as though the dim light of the present had unlocked doors long kept shut. To understand the scars, one had to return to where the silence first took root, to the narrow streets of Ruislip, where Andy Serkis was born in 1964. His childhood was a tangle of contrasts, a home filled with artistic curiosity, yet threaded with long spells of emotional distance. His mother, a teacher, carried tenderness in her voice but exhaustion in her eyes. His father, a medical doctor, often stationed abroad, moved in and out of Andy's world like a passing season. It was in those early absences that Andy first learned a subtle truth. People could love you deeply and still leave you standing alone in doorways. As a boy, he would sit by the radio, listening to foreign broadcasts his father had sent home, imagining places he had never seen, but also feeling a quiet ache, a yearning he could not name. The house itself held a particular stillness, not cold but careful, as though every emotion had to be softened before crossing the room. He found refuge in drawing, in stories, in inhabiting characters no one else could see. Even then, transformation felt natural to him, a way of escaping the weight he couldn't yet understand. But beneath the imaginative bloom was a quieter wound, the feeling of being overlooked, of blending into the edges of his own family portrait. There was one moment, small, almost unremarkable, that later became the first crack in his trust. A promise made to him on a foggy winter morning, one he believed with the full force of childhood sincerity, was broken without explanation. He waited by the window for hours, watching the frost melt from the glass, convinced there must be a reason, a delay, anything. None came, and in that stillness, something shifted. He learned that expectation was dangerous, that hope carried a cost. Years later, he would say that this was when he first understood the shape of disappointment, a lesson that would echo through every relationship afterward, forming the earliest layer of the silence he would never quite escape. The years that followed unfolded quickly, as though life itself sensed Andy's hunger to outrun the quiet wounds of childhood. In his late teens, the world began to widen. Drama clubs, student plays, the first trembling moments on stage under hot lights that revealed not just his face, but the depth of his inner world. At Lancaster University, he found what felt like a new beginning, a place where voices rose freely, where emotions did not need to tiptoe through rooms. For the first time, Andy discovered that inhabiting another character didn't numb his pain. It transformed it. His ascent was not sudden, but it was steady, built from long nights in worn rehearsal spaces, scripts annotated until the margins could hold no more ink, and performances that startled even his closest peers with their rawness. There was something different about him, a willingness to fracture himself open for a role, to disappear completely and return changed. Directors noticed, audiences leaned in, and Andy, who had once felt invisible, now saw entire rooms fall silent as he stepped into the light. But with recognition came the early shadows of pressure. The theater world could be warm, but it could also be unforgiving, its expectations tightening around him like an invisible rope. Still, he pressed forward. Through uncertainties, through rejections that cut deeper than he admitted, through the unspoken fear that each performance might be the last one that mattered. Then came the turning point, the role that would redefine his place in cinema, Gollum. It was both a blessing and a burden, a character that demanded he dive into the darkest recesses of human longing and obsession. Motion capture was still in its infancy, yet Andy embraced it with an almost reckless devotion. He spent hours studying movement, bending his body into unnatural shapes, letting his voice fracture into guttural whispers. The success was immediate, astonishing, global. The world applauded him, praised the innovation, celebrated his genius. But beneath the blinding light of acclaim, a faint loneliness lingered. Success, he realized, could isolate just as easily as failure. People saw the brilliance, but rarely the toll it demanded. The emotional exhaustion, the sleepless nights, the private fear that he was giving too much of himself away. Yet he continued. From Gollum to King Kong, from Caesar to countless other roles, he became the silent architect of a new kind of acting. Awards followed, interviews, long flights, lights, cameras, more lights. Each flash reminding him of how far he'd come, yet how familiar the old ache remained. And in the midst of triumph, he felt the first distant tremor of what would one day become betrayal. Subtle, unexpected, the kind that slips between applause and solitude. Because in the world he was rising into, admiration could turn quickly, and trust was often the first casualty. Success, for all its glow, cast long shadows. As Andy moved deeper into the world he had fought so hard to enter, the cracks that once trembled quietly beneath the surface began to widen. It happened slowly at first, a shifted tone in a meeting, a promise made with a smile that didn't reach the eyes, a silence that lasted a little too long after he left the room. What began as faint discomfort soon sharpened into a truth he could no longer ignore. Not everyone who applauded him wished him well. The initial rupture came during a project he had poured his soul into, a film he believed would mark a new chapter in his artistic journey. He had given everything. Long nights, strained muscles, the fragile emotional spaces he rarely shared. But when negotiations began, when recognition was discussed, when credit was divided, he saw how easily devotion could be dismissed. A colleague he trusted, someone he had confided in, chose ambition over loyalty. Their words, spoken behind closed doors, shifted the narrative, quietly rewriting his contribution. Andy didn't confront him immediately. Instead, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest. That childhood lesson resurfacing, the one that had taught him disappointment arrives quietly, almost politely. He watched the situation unfold like an observer, rather than the wounded participant, realizing that trust, once cracked, never returned the same shape. There were other betrayals too, subtle ones. A director he admired withdrawing support at a crucial moment. A studio executive praising his work publicly while undermining him privately. Each incident chipped at him. Not enough to break him, but enough to steal a little more warmth from his outlook. He learned that in cinema, as in life, applause could coexist with abandonment. People could celebrate the performance yet overlook the person. And so, Andy retreated inward. Not dramatically, not bitterly, but quietly, tightening his world into a smaller, safer circle. The bright rooms of fame felt colder, the voices around him more calculating, the promises more fragile. Since then, he carried certain names not on paper, but in silence, etched into memory, dulled but never erased. 5 faces, 5 stories. 5 wounds time had failed to soften. 5 names, 5 wounds, 5 stories Andy Serkis never managed to set down, no matter how many roles he inhabited or worlds he helped create. They were not written in journals, nor spoken aloud in interviews, but carried deep within him, quiet, persistent, shaping the man behind the performances. And on that evening, with the fading light clinging to his face, he allowed those memories to surface, one by one, each with its own weight. The first person was someone gentle, almost painfully so. A first love from his early 20s, when emotions were unfiltered and trust was still a language he spoke fluently. She had believed in him, or so he thought, cheering from the front row during those small, uncertain performances. But the moment a chance arrived to step into a brighter social circle, she let go of his hand without hesitation. There was no argument, no dramatic ending, only a quiet departure disguised as needing space. Andy remembered standing in that narrow hallway, hearing the door close with a softness that hurt more than if it had slammed. It was his first lesson that affection could evaporate without noise, leaving behind a hollow ache far louder. She was not cruel, only young. Yet the wound she left was the lightest and therefore the earliest to fade, though never fully disappear. The second person arrived much later, at a time when Andy was beginning to carve out his legacy in motion capture. This betrayal was sharper, unexpected. A colleague who had praised him publicly but privately campaigned to diminish his contribution. Andy discovered the truth by accident, reading an email not meant for his eyes. The man had rewritten history with alarming ease, positioning himself as the pioneer and reducing Andy's groundbreaking work to support. It stunned him, like stepping onto a stage only to realize the floor had been pulled away. It wasn't jealousy that hurt, but the realization that admiration could be performed. This betrayal was sudden, cutting, the kind that forces a person to reconsider every handshake, every compliment, every promise that had once felt sincere. The third person was family, and the wound far deeper. Not out of malice, but misunderstanding. During the peak of Andy's early fame, when interviews and premieres crowded his schedule, a relative accused him of abandoning his roots, of letting ambition swallow the boy he once was. The words were flung in frustration, carelessly, but they pierced with extraordinary precision. Andy had always balanced the weight of expectations, the silent pressure to succeed without forgetting where he came from. Hearing those accusations, spoken by someone whose approval he cherished, felt like the breaking of an anchor. It was not an argument, it was a fracture. And though the relationship survived in polite form, the warmth never fully returned. This wound settled deep, becoming part of the quiet sorrow that accompanied even his greatest achievements. The fourth person was not an individual but a collective presence. The public, the industry, the invisible crowd that lifts one moment and dismisses the next. Andy remembered clearly the period when his contributions to motion capture were debated, minimized, questioned. When magazines printed sentences like, "But is it really acting?" When some dismissed his craft as mere digital trickery. He felt the sting of being simultaneously praised and denied. Standing on red carpets, he often sensed the contradiction, celebrated for revolutionizing performance, yet overlooked when recognition truly mattered. He never hated the world for this, but the disappointment settled like dust on old film reels. The betrayal of the crowd is always public, and therefore the most humiliating. And then came the fifth. He paused before speaking of this final figure, as though the act of remembering required a deeper breath. This one had no face separate from his own, no voice external to him. The fifth person Andy Serkis could never fully forgive was himself. For the years he pushed too hard, ignoring exhaustion. For the times he allowed others to take more than they gave. For the moments he doubted his worth and bent himself into shapes to earn validation he never needed. He blamed himself for trusting too quickly, for staying silent when he should have spoken, for carrying wounds long after the source had faded. This self-directed ache was the heaviest, the most loyal, the one that shadowed him through every triumph. And that, he whispered, is the scar that lingers the longest, the one we carve with our own hands. Because forgiveness, he realized, is simplest when offered to strangers, and almost impossible when owed to oneself. The room grew quieter as Andy's confession settled into the fading evening light. The kind of silence that feels less like absence and more like understanding. He leaned back slightly, the weight of decades resting on his shoulders, yet something in his expression had softened, as though naming the scars had loosened their grip. Outside, the city hummed in distant tones, unaware that a man inside this dim apartment had finally unburdened truths he'd carried alone for far too long. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had shaped countless characters, worlds, and emotions. And for a brief moment, he allowed himself to breathe without the heaviness of expectation. Regret still lingered, yes, but it no longer felt like a chain. More like a story finally spoken, a memory given permission to fade. He reflected on the 5 names, the 5 chapters of hurt that had molded him as much as his triumphs had. Some wounds had pushed him forward, others had slowed him down, but together they formed the strange, imperfect map of a life fully lived. Perhaps the point had never been to forget, or even to forgive completely, but to understand, to see how light and shadow had shaped him in equal measure. And as he gazed out into the growing dusk, a quiet thought flickered through him, gentle yet profound. Maybe the scars were not signs of weakness, but reminders of all the ways he had survived. Can a person truly move on without forgiving? Or do we sometimes need the ache just to remember that we once loved, trusted, and dared to hope?